He was just another black man pulled over on a quiet evening until he calmly handed the officer a badge that could end careers. What started as racial profiling turned into a shocking revelation that rocked the entire police department. You won't believe who he really was, and how one man turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for justice. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The sun dipped low over Charlotte, North Carolina, casting long amber streaks across the highway as the city eased into the golden quiet of early evening. Rush hour was thinning. The air had that familiar blend of exhaust humidity and something else tension you couldn't see but could feel if you paid enough attention. Leonard Brooks didn't rush. At 65, he had mastered the pace of purpose. He sat upright, in his well-maintained sedan fingers, loose on the wheel eyes, steady behind silver-rimmed glasses. Dressed in a crisp navy shirt and charcoal slacks, he looked like someone heading home from a late meeting. And he was. A closed-door session with federal officials had just concluded one of those high-stakes policy conversations about misconduct oversight, the kind where words are carefully measured and names are spoken in low tones. He had only gone a few miles before the blue and red strobe of a patrol car lit up behind him. A siren wailed once, quick and sharp. Leonard's eyebrows lifted slightly. No traffic infraction came to mind. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The cruiser behind him nudged closer, as if asserting not just presence, but dominance. With the calm of a man who had seen far worse in far stranger places, Leonard signaled ease to the shoulder and rolled down his window. The officer approached slowly, methodical steps, wide stance hand resting just a little too comfortably near his belt. He was young, maybe early 30s, pale buzz cut, his face blank, but brimming with something unspoken. His badge caught the sun. Officer Ryan Keller. License and registration, he said, not bothering with a greeting. Leonard obliged, silently opening his glove compartment with smooth, deliberate movements. His hands didn't tremble. They never did. "You know why I pulled you over?" Keller asked. Leonard looked up, voice calm. "No, officer. I don't." "You didn't fully stop at the last intersection." Leonard paused, thoughtful. "I recall slowing, but if I failed to come to a complete stop, that was my error." His voice was warm, respectful. The kind of tone that diffuses most things, but not this. Keller stared at the license, his expression tightening as his eyes scanned the name. He blinked, then looked back at Leonard, and something in his posture shifted. A flicker of recognition, maybe confusion, but it vanished behind a smirk. "You from around here?" he asked. "I work in the area," Leonard replied simply. Keller didn't nod. He didn't smile. He leaned in slightly too close. "Kind of late to be dressed up, isn't it? It's been a long day." Doing what Leonard tilted his head slightly. "I wasn't aware that was part of the stop." Keller's jaw flexed. "It is now." Leonard knew that tone. He'd heard it before in border checkpoints, overseas in interrogation rooms with foreign operatives, and occasionally on American soil, from men who believed their badge gave them the right to command without question. It was the tone of assumption. "Step out of the vehicle," Keller said, voice sharp. Leonard blinked once, Is there probable cause for that request? You're being uncooperative. I've answered every question, officer. That's not your call to make. The tension thickened. A couple of passing cars slowed. No one stopped. No one ever stopped. Leonard sighed softly and opened the door. He stepped out tall, composed his posture, betraying none of the insult he had just absorbed. The sun caught the gray in his beard, the poise in his shoulders. Keller, shorter than he'd thought now, stood looking up at a man he could no longer frame as just another. Hands on the hood. Leonard raised an eyebrow. Do you suspect I'm armed? Keller didn't answer. Slowly, Leonard turned and placed his palms against the hood. The metal was warm, buzzing faintly from the engine's recent hum. Behind him, he heard Keller approach, footsteps deliberate. He was being sized up, searched, prodded for guilt that didn't exist. When Keller finished, he stepped back, clearly dissatisfied. You sure you've got nothing to hide? He muttered. Leonard turned slowly, his eyes sharp now, a different kind of quiet emerging, one that held history and knowledge forged in years, not just of survival, but leadership. Officer Keller. He said, voice, even you've made at least 3 assumptions since I rolled down that window. Keller blinked, caught off guard by the measured calm. Excuse me, you assumed I didn't know the law. You assumed my silence was fear. And you assumed I'm the kind of man who lets that pass. Keller opened his mouth, but Leonard reached calmly into his back pocket, producing a black leather case. Keller's hand moved toward his holster. Leonard didn't flinch. He opened the wallet and turned it slowly so the sun caught the gleam of the gold badge and federal seal. Leonard Brooks, he said, Director of Internal Affairs, Southeast Division. I oversee conduct reviews across 6 states, including this precinct. Silence fell like a dropped gavel. Keller's eyes darted between the badge and the man he had just patted down. His mouth moved, but no words came. Leonard took a step forward, but his tone remained steady. I suggest you remember this moment well, he said. Not because I outrank you. Not because your career may now hang in the balance, but because this right here was never about safety. It was about perception. Yours. A car slowed on the opposite side of the road. A phone held out the window. Recording. Keller stepped back, jaw tightening. The performance was over. The reality had set in. Leonard brushed off his sleeves, not because they needed it, but because dignity demanded it. He didn't say another word. He returned to his vehicle, closed the door with a soft click, and drove off into the twilight, leaving behind the echo of a truth too heavy for one badge to carry. Because the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The flashing lights had long faded into memory, but their echo remained in Leonard Brooks's chest like an unshakable drumbeat. By the time he pulled into his driveway that night, the evening sun had completely surrendered to a bruised purple sky. The quiet of his Berkeley neighborhood returned indifferent to what had happened just 30 minutes earlier on the side of a tree-lined road. But Leonard wasn't indifferent. Inside his modest home, a 2-bedroom house filled with framed memories of a career in justice, he removed his suit jacket slowly, each movement deliberate, not because of his age, but because of the gravity resting on his shoulders. He placed the jacket over the back of a chair, loosened his tie, and exhaled. He didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he stared at a black and white photo of himself, taken in 1985 young, determined a fresh graduate from Howard University's criminal law program, standing in front of the Supreme Court building with ambition in his eyes. So much had changed since then. He had learned patience, tact, the long arc of justice. But in moments like this, when a younger, uninformed officer had looked at him through the windshield and saw not a respected name in law enforcement, but just a black man behind the wheel of a Lexus, Leonard felt the same bitter twinge he had known as a boy in 1960s Alabama. He poured a glass of water, though he wished it were something stronger. Not for escape, but for resolve. There was work to do. He sat at his desk, opened a leather-bound notebook, and began to write. Not a statement, not a complaint. A record. Leonard had kept such records for decades, each entry documenting not only systemic failures he'd investigated during his long tenure, but also the subtle, often invisible fractures of human decency. Today's date, April 14th, 7:48 p.m. Location? Marin Boulevard southbound. Officer name, not provided. Approx. Late 30s. Caucasian brown hair, mirrored sunglasses. Initial stop. Red light yield unspecified violation. Interaction duration, approx. 9 minutes. Behavioral notes. Escalated tone assumption of suspicion without cause. Verbal dominance tactics failed to request identity before demanding submission. He paused, pressing the pen to paper harder than he intended. His hand didn't tremble, but his thoughts did. It wasn't just that the officer, he would later learn his name was Matt Corbin, had treated Leonard with cold suspicion. It was that he had done it with muscle memory. The way his fingers hovered near his holster, the way his voice carried the weight of someone who had done this before and expected it to play out the same way. What disturbed Leonard most wasn't the act, it was the familiarity of it. This wasn't 1968 in Montgomery. This was California in 2025. But the script hadn't changed. He thought of his grandson, Jordan, a college sophomore who still believed the world was moving forward. Leonard had always told him progress isn't permanent. You have to hold it. But now he wondered if they'd ever truly moved forward, or if the same poison had just learned better camouflage. The next morning, Leonard arrived at the Oakland Internal Affairs Division building earlier than usual. His office was on the top floor, overlooking the city skyline, but he barely looked out the window. Instead, he sat at the long conference table, flipping through complaints that mirrored his own experience. Minority men stopped for routine checks. Women of color asked if the car they drove was theirs. Elders spoken to like suspects instead of citizens. A soft knock came at the door. Director Brooks. It was Clara, his assistant. We have the officer ID from yesterday's stop. Patrol log confirms Officer Matthew Corbin, Precinct 17. Leonard nodded. Thank you. She hesitated before leaving. Sir, I just wanted to say I saw the video, the one someone took. It's spreading. On Nextdoor, Twitter, even got posted to Reddit. Leonard raised an eyebrow. It's not long, but it's powerful. You didn't even raise your voice. He didn't smile. Did I need to? Clara shook her head, eyes softening. No. That's what made it hit harder. As she left, Leonard opened the video. Only 45 seconds? Grainy phone footage, but clear enough. Officer Corbin standing stiff, issuing sharp commands. Leonard standing calmly, hands visible, voice, quiet but firm. Is there a lawful reason for this stop, officer? The final frame. Leonard revealing his badge. Corbin's face visibly changes. The video wasn't the whole story, but it was enough. Leonard sat back. He knew he had a choice now. To file a formal report, to let the system handle Corbin, or to take a different route. The formal route would likely lead to a closed-door reprimand, sensitivity training and a line in a personnel file no one ever reads. But this wasn't about punishing one man. It was about the thousands who'd never get the chance to reveal a badge and level the playing field. Later that week, Leonard requested a review meeting with Chief Melanie Torres, a colleague he respected deeply. Inside her office, he laid out everything: his account, the video, and the deeper concern. "Mel," he said, "this wasn't just about me. This is about how many people Officer Corbin has pulled over with that same posture, that same tone, and they didn't have my title or my calm." She listened, jaw tight. "You want him off the streets?" Leonard shook his head. "I want him aware. I want him retrained. And I want his precinct audited, because I have a feeling the problem doesn't end with him. And if we meet resistance, then we name it. Publicly." Chief Torres nodded slowly. "You're not just filing a complaint, you're lighting a fuse." Leonard looked her in the eye. "Then let it burn, because I'm done letting quiet men in dark uniforms whisper away their bias under the cover of procedure." Outside the window, the city moved on. People rushed to jobs, errands, appointments. They didn't know what had almost happened that evening on Marin Boulevard. They didn't know how close injustice had come to becoming just another statistic. But Leonard knew, and now he had decided this wouldn't be buried in a drawer. This would be the beginning of a reckoning. Because he wasn't the victim of a stop. He was the mirror held up to a system still broken. And now, he intended to make sure it finally saw itself. In the weeks following the stop, the ripple effect began. At first, it was quiet. A few forwarded links, a shared video, a local podcast picking up the story. But like all things that strike a nerve buried deep in the public's skin, the silence didn't last. Conversations emerged at coffee counters and classrooms, on city buses, about what it meant when a black man 65 years old and decorated for decades of honorable service could be seen not as a community protector, but as a presumed threat. Leonard Brooks had not spoken publicly. He didn't need to. The video spoke for itself, and more importantly, it stirred the conscience of a city. But behind the scenes, Leonard wasn't waiting. He was working, not for vengeance, not even for Officer Matt Corbin's dismissal. He was working for something far more elusive: truth backed by accountability. Inside the Internal Affairs Division, Leonard began pulling records. Not just Corbin's, but those in his entire patrol unit. He wasn't surprised by what he found, but that didn't make it easier to look at. Over the past 18 months, Officer Corbin had initiated 142 traffic stops. 96 involved drivers of color. 48 had no citation issued. 15 resulted in complaints, none of which were sustained. Not because the complaints lacked merit, because they lacked power. Leonard's pen hovered over Corbin's internal file. It was thin, dangerously thin. And that wasn't a sign of innocence, it was a sign of silence. That was the sickness he had spent a career trying to uproot. Not the overt racism, not the blatant violations, but the slow rot of unchallenged authority. The kind that allowed men like Corbin to believe they were doing their jobs when in fact they were profiling, posturing, and provoking. Leonard knew what would come next. Once this process went public, the pushback would be swift. One incident can't define a man. He's just doing his job. You're overreacting. But Leonard also knew something else. The uniform, as sacred as it could be, was not a shield from consequence. And in fact, when worn improperly, it magnified harm. Because what people feared most wasn't just the action, it was that the person taking it did so with the full weight of the system behind him. And that system Leonard now intended to confront from within. He drafted a memorandum for the Office of Police Standards. It was precise, stripped of emotion, but laced with truth. In it, he called for an independent inquiry, not only into Officer Corbin, but into the training practices at Precinct 17. He cited statistical anomalies, complaint, inconsistencies, and discrepancies in body cam usage. He used data because he knew emotion would be dismissed, but he didn't withhold his name. At the bottom of the memo, he signed clearly Leonard J. Brooks, Director of Internal Affairs, Oakland Division. The next day, the leak hit the news. An anonymous source shared the memo with a local reporter who broke the story with quiet fury. Top official files. Complaint against fellow officer after racially charged stop. The headline didn't say much, but the implications said everything. Leonard expected backlash, but what he didn't expect, at least not this quickly, was support. From fellow officers, from community leaders, from people who had never spoken up before. One email read, "I worked with Corbin 5 years ago. I saw things. I stayed quiet. I shouldn't have." Another, "I filed a complaint about him last summer. It was dismissed. Thank you for not looking away." The stories began to build brick by brick into a structure of accountability Leonard had long dreamed about but never fully seen. He was invited to speak on a panel about community trust in law enforcement. At first, he declined, but then he thought of the faces, young, old, weary, silenced, and he said yes. Standing behind the podium at the town hall, Leonard adjusted the microphone, his voice low and steady. "I've worn a badge for over 40 years," he began. "I've seen what it can represent when worn with honor. But I've also seen what happens when that badge is mistaken for a license to intimidate rather than to protect." He looked out into the crowd. There were officers in uniform, students with notepads, mothers holding toddlers, men who had stopped believing in justice long ago. "I was pulled over because I was presumed to be something I'm not," he said. "But the greater tragedy is that even if I weren't the Director of Internal Affairs, even if I were just another citizen running errands, I still wouldn't have deserved that treatment." Silence filled the hall. Not empty silence, listening silence. "A badge should never grant you power over another person's dignity," Leonard continued. "It should bind you to their rights, not rise above them." When the forum ended, people came forward not for autographs, not for photo ops, but for something far deeper. Confession, gratitude, resolve. One retired officer said, "You said what I never dared to. Thank you." Later that evening, Leonard sat alone in his office. A single lamp lit the room. His fingers hovered over a yellowing envelope tucked in the corner of a drawer. He pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from his father, written in 1967. "Son, the world won't always see you for who you are. But if you fight with integrity one day, it will have no choice but to look again." Leonard folded the letter slowly. That day had come, and he wasn't finished yet. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about correction. The kind that doesn't just discipline a man, but redirects an entire institution. Because in the end, the badge doesn't define the man, but the man, every single day, defines what the badge will mean. And Leonard Brooks had just reminded a city what it should have meant all along. For most of his life, Leonard Brooks had chosen discretion over visibility. He believed in quiet professionalism, in doing his work with precision and principle, never looking for applause, never asking for credit. But the incident on that dusky roadside and everything that followed had upended the very notion that silence equaled strength. Now dignity alone wasn't enough. It had to evolve into something actionable, into a directive. Leonard had spent decades building a career on the backbone of integrity. He had trained rookies, mentored senior officers, conducted sensitive investigations that demanded both steel and empathy. But none of that preparation had truly readied him for the weight of what came after that night with Officer Matt Corbin. Because what Leonard realized, what haunted him most, was not that Corbin made a mistake, but that the system had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. So Leonard did what leaders do. When faced with moral responsibility, he redefined his role. He convened an emergency ethics review board, inviting external advisors, community activists, and former officers with clean records and unshakable reputations. His first instruction wasn't about policy, it was about presence. We will listen. First, he told them. Then we will act. He wasn't interested in optics. He wanted structure results change with teeth. They didn't start with big picture legislation. They started with small truths, stories, patterns. A woman from East Oakland shared how her teenage son had been stopped and searched 3 times in 1 month with no citation. A young black lawyer recalled how a simple question to an officer about his rights had escalated into threats. Leonard listened to every testimony, not as a director, as a man who had once believed good intentions were enough. He knew now they weren't. At the next department-wide roll call, Leonard stood before nearly 200 officers. Some respected him. Others feared what was coming, but none could ignore him. I wore this badge when some of you weren't even born, he said, his voice steady, his posture unshaken. I've carried it through riots, bomb threats, and dark corners of this city where no backup came. But never once did I confuse the authority I was given with the power to humiliate someone. There was silence tight and loaded. And if you think that badge entitles you to act without empathy or escalate without reason, then you're not the kind of officer I swore to serve beside. This isn't about politics. This is about moral architecture. And if you crack that foundation, the whole house falls. He didn't need to shout. His tone did the work. And what followed wasn't fear, but a shift. Officers, both veterans and new recruits, began coming forward quietly, earnestly. Some admitted to biases they hadn't faced. Others shared their confusion about protocol versus instinct. Leonard didn't punish honesty. He cultivated it. Because he knew if dignity was to survive in law enforcement, it had to be built into the bones. From those sessions came a new initiative, the Brooks Directive. It wasn't flashy. It didn't parade as reform. It functioned like a blueprint, an 8-week immersive course combining real-world de-escalation, cultural competency, implicit bias, dismantling, and psychological resilience. But unlike most trainings, it didn't end in a certificate. It ended in reflection. Each officer had to write and present a personal accountability statement, a document not of compliance, but conviction. What would they do differently moving forward? What assumptions had they unearthed? What did justice actually mean when no one was watching? To Leonard, that mattered more than any courtroom ruling. The program was met with skepticism, then interest, then endorsement. Departments from nearby counties requested access. A neighboring city offered to pilot it within their force. Leonard didn't see it as expansion. He saw it as replication. a model worth sharing. Still, he kept his circle grounded. Lieutenant Harris, his longtime colleague and closest confidant, once asked, "You think this really sticks?" Lenny Leonard sipped his coffee, watching the sunrise press gold against the city skyline. "I don't need everyone to change," he replied. "I just need enough of them to lead." And that's what the directive became, a torch passed from one hand to another. Not from the top down, but from within. From one officer saying, "That's not who we are," to another beginning to believe it. Leonard didn't chase applause. He chased impact. He remembered what his father used to say: principles don't shout, they stand. And now, in precincts across Oakland and beyond, they were standing taller than ever. Because dignity, when tested, must become more than memory. It must become a map. And Leonard Brooks was drawing the lines. The hearing was not held in a grand courtroom, nor broadcast for public consumption. It took place in a modest conference chamber inside the Oakland Police Department, wood-paneled walls, an outdated clock ticking far too loudly, and a round table at the center that had seen more excuses than accountability over the years. But today, that table would carry something different consequence. Leonard Brooks sat at one end, not as a retired commander, not as a symbol, but as a man who had seen both sides of the badge, its power and its danger. Across from him sat Officer Matt Corbin, the man who had tried to reduce him to a stereotype beneath the glow of a red and blue siren. Corbin's uniform was pressed, but the tension in his posture betrayed a different story. He wasn't in control here. Not anymore. The Internal Review Committee, made up of legal experts, veteran officers, and civilians from the Oversight Board, began the proceedings with a reading of the events. Not just the body cam footage, but transcripts, complaint records, and testimony Leonard's and others. As the room absorbed each detail, a new truth took shape. This wasn't just about one stop. This was about the culture that allowed it. When it was time for Leonard to speak, he stood slowly. His voice was calm, deliberate. "This is not a personal vendetta," he began. "If it were, I'd have walked away that night satisfied knowing who I was and who Officer Corbin would eventually answer to. But this is bigger than either of us. It's about the message we send when the badge becomes a mirror, and what's reflected isn't justice but unchecked assumption." He paused, scanning the table. "I spent over 30 years in law enforcement. I've seen men break under pressure. I've seen courage in impossible moments, and I've seen officers forget the very oath they swore to uphold. The question today isn't whether Matt Corbin made a mistake. It's whether we're brave enough to admit that mistake lives in a system that keeps replicating itself." Silence followed. Not from fear, but from truth settling into the bones of everyone present. Corbin didn't offer a defense. His attorney did the talking, framing the incident as a misread situation, an unfortunate escalation. But the room felt different now. Hollow justifications had no weight against the evidence, and even less against Leonard's dignity. When the verdict was read, it wasn't a surprise. Officer Corbin's conduct was ruled a breach of department code, gross negligence in judgment, and misuse of authority. He was stripped of his badge, effective immediately. There was no applause, no gavel bang, just a quiet acknowledgement that someone had finally been held accountable. Leonard left the room with no celebration, just a steady breath. The consequences rippled quickly. A press release confirmed Corbin's dismissal and outlined a new departmental review framework modeled on the Brooks Directive. Officers would now undergo mandatory bias response assessments every quarter, and Leonard had been asked to consult on the implementation. He accepted not for pride, but for purpose. What surprised him most in the days that followed were the letters. One came from a rookie officer in San Diego. "I never knew what systemic bias looked like until I saw what happened to you. Thank you for not backing down." Another from a mother in New Jersey. "You made me feel like someone finally sees my son, that he matters." And one handwritten in tight cursive from an elderly black veteran in Mississippi. "They tried to forget us. You reminded them we're still here, still watching, still worthy." Leonard didn't reply to every message, but he read every word. He knew the system wouldn't change overnight. Some officers would resist. Some would claim victimhood. But he also knew that culture bends when enough people push. One afternoon, months later, Leonard stood in front of a graduating class at the Oakland Police Academy. He wasn't there to hand out badges. He was there to hand out truth. The badge, he told them, holding his up, isn't just a shield, it's a reflection. When you wear it, ask yourself, who are you reflecting back to the world? Are you showing them fear, or fairness, arrogance, or empathy? Because if the badge becomes a mask, you've already lost what it was meant to protect. He didn't need applause. He needed understanding. And when the recruits stood, not in ceremony, but in shared silence, each one looking him in the eye, he saw it. The badge had met its reflection. And this time, it didn't turn away. Leonard Brooks never expected his twilight years to become the most defining chapter of his life. At 65, after decades of service in law enforcement, retirement had offered him peace-quiet routines and the rare satisfaction of having survived a system he once believed in. But it was a single evening, a routine traffic stop turned hostile that reminded him the work of justice doesn't end with a pension. It begins often when the uniform is gone, but the responsibility remains. When Officer Matt Corbin stopped Leonard that night, he didn't see a man of honor, history, or rank. He saw a black man behind the wheel, and his reaction was shaped not by reason, but by prejudice. That moment could have ended in silence, shame, or tragedy. But Leonard didn't meet aggression with anger. He met it with composure, truth, and the power of knowing exactly who he was and who he was dealing with. The revelation that Leonard was the head of internal affairs shook more than Corbin's ego. It exposed the quiet confidence many officers carry, thinking they are above consequence when cloaked in authority. But Leonard's story wasn't just about personal vindication. It became a spotlight on a system that too often protects its own at the cost of the people it claims to serve. Instead of letting the incident fade into another footnote, Leonard stepped forward not for revenge, but for reform. Through hearings, public accountability, and the creation of the Brooks Directive, he helped transform a personal insult into institutional change. His poise became a rallying point, his words a manual for courage, and his example a mirror for the law enforcement community to examine its reflection. And in doing so, Leonard proved that dignity, even when cornered, can become directive. That age does not dull conviction, and that justice doesn't retire. The lesson in Leonard's journey is not just for officers, but for all of us. In a world quick to judge, react, and divide, we are reminded that integrity doesn't raise its voice, it stands its ground. That power should never shield wrongdoing, and silence when we witness injustice is not neutrality, it's complicity. In our everyday lives, we may never face a moment as dramatic as Leonard's, But we will face choices whether to speak when others stay quiet, whether to document what others ignore, whether to carry ourselves with the calm force of someone who knows the truth matters no matter the cost. So if Leonard's story moved you, if it made you reflect, pause, or feel seen, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel to support more stories like this. Your engagement helps uncover the untold truths, amplify voices often overlooked, and remind us that justice isn't a destination, it's a daily decision. Because one man's stand in the fading light sparked a conversation that traveled far beyond the street where it began. Be part of that conversation. Stand with dignity. Walk with purpose. And let's keep the light burning together.